them. Basically, the focus of the dissertation is on the notion of what an individual is in Spinoza's thought. So I have two main concerns. My primary concern is to answer what Spinoza thinks an individual is, not in specifics, this thing's an individual, that thing's an individual, but in general, what kind of thing is an individual. And I have a secondary aim, and it's not developed quite as fully, but we start to go in that direction. And that secondary aim is what this conception of an individual leads to in the realms of ethics, and a little bit in the realms of some political theory, although that's more speculative and outlining the political part. So on. In chapter 1, which is the largest, I argued this at some length because I thought it was important. I think there's a distinction that Spinoza uses that's something like the distinction you find in a medieval thinker like Duns Scotus, formal objective distinction, where you have something that's truly distinct but is not actually separable. So there's a real distinction there in the sense there's an extra mental distinction. And I spent some time arguing that Spinoza holds such a distinction or something like it, even though he probably doesn't do so deliberately. I wouldn't call it that. At least I don't think so. So I spent some time talking about that, which I think is an important part of chapter 1. And I also discussed in chapter 1 whether or not we want to align with one of two dominant conceptions of the relationship between substance and modes in Spinoza's thought. We have the traditional reading that modes are properties of substance, and since there's only one substance, everything in the universe is a property or somehow adjectival on that one substance. That's one reading. Then there's a reading made famous by Curley that to say that substance and modes modes are in substance is really just sort of to say that modes are caused on substance or they're radically dependent on substance, which is something that sort of rejects the adjectival view or the property view. I follow Bennett in reading Spinoza as holding a field metaphysic, and I think that the theory of distinctions that I give to Spinoza, the formal objective style distinction, is something that allows that reading to go and fit in very nicely. Bennett spends a great deal of time defending his reading. I spent some length on that. The defense is in there. The main argument, and I want to actually do give the argument for this one, that Bennett is driving at here, is that Spinoza sees reality, quoting Bennett here, first how he sees reality, and then Bennett's argument for it, and then I'll move to the rest of the dissertation. Bennett says that this part of Spinoza's metaphysics can be approached through a story of Newton's. God decides to add a mountain to the world, which he does, I'm quoting Bennett here, by modifying a certain mountain-shaped and sized region of space that affects everything else just as mountains do. Other bodies can't enter. If they reach the region quickly, sound is emitted as they are bent or shattered, light is reflected, and so on. If the job were done right, Newton says, we would have every reason to believe that a mountain had been added to the furniture of the world. And he doesn't want us to worry about why Newton was interested in this thought experiment. But for Spinoza, he says, this points to a way of bringing the concept of substance to bear on the extended world without implying that mountains are or are made of substances. It suggests that there is just one substance, namely the whole of space, regions of which give various qualities such as impenetrability, mass, and so forth. So that any proposition asserting the existence of a body reduces to saying something about a region of space. Although Bennett doesn't say bodies are just a region of space, but something like a spatial, temporally continuous set of place-times, to use Bennett's phrase there. So it seems like a kind of a bizarre reading, but it's sort of a reading that allows us to say, things are ultimately ways in which our mode, would be the Latin word, substance exists. Bennett compares this, things deep down are really the passing along of something qualitative. Everything is in a certain sense like a thaw, when a thaw moves through a countryside. Nothing is moving. Different parts are being affected in different ways as the thaw moves. He gives several arguments for this. The most interesting one is where he discusses Spinoza in his fourth letter. He gives that letters to Henry Oldenburg. Says that men are not created or destroyed. Basically, that their bodies existed in some sort of different form. If anything really was destroyed, say a particular man really was destroyed, that would have to be the annihilation of all space. If anything was truly destroyed rather than transformed. And Bennett says basically the true annihilation of something, the only possible way Bennett thinks, I don't know if it's the only possible, but it's certainly the most reasonable, I think. The only possible way to read this passage is to understand that the true annihilation of an individual thing would be the annihilation of a region of space. And since there's one Euclidean space, when it says this would mean the destruction of all space. And Spinoza does say something very like this in the letter and the passage that it builds on. He has some other reasons too, but that seems to be some of his strongest. And I spent a number of time on finite because I think this is a particularly important issue. Right? How precisely does Spinoza view the relationship between his one substance and his modes? Is it really adjectival? How can you explain that? And Binet, I think, is a good example. Let's jump to chapter 2. Chapter 2 I can cover kind of briefly here, then we'll move on to 3, 4, and 5. Chapter 2 basically looks at the main text that are involved with Spinoza's notion of individuals and some problems with that account. The main point here is to look at Spinoza's physics. He doesn't really have a full theory of physics, but he has some sketches for what a physics might look like. These are in the lemmas following Ethics 2, Book 2, Proposition 13, and everything associated with that area. And he follows kind of a Cartesian planum physics. You have a bunch of bodies in motion, and sort of the ultimate principles are motion and rest, however you want to translate that, quickness and slowness. And this is how bodies are distinguished from one another, simply by motion and rest. And this is fairly Cartesian in this regard, although there is a big difference between Descartes and Spinoza. Descartes needs extended world to be kind of held in motion, have motion imparted to it by an external agent, and Spinoza holds that it's sort of inherently in movement. This is something essential. There's no external agent in Spinoza. So starting with the physics, there's a big push, and this is where the interesting notion of what an individual is, to talk about individuation in terms of the individuation of bodies by physical laws or physical principles, motion and rest, specifically. And what's quite interesting about this is there tend to be two forces in the literature. There are those that think of Spinoza as placing individuation really in the context of physics. And I've come to think that's probably correct. But there is a fairly large voice in the scholarly literature that says that when Spinoza is talking about individuals, he's talking about organisms. Or he really is only talking about organisms, or he only has organisms in mind. Binet says something to this effect. Hans Jonas, in a very influential article, says that Spinoza really only means that everything that's an individual is an organism and everything that's an organism is an individual. But I don't think that's going to work. When I started writing this, I actually thought it might. But I don't think so. That's just simply not going to fly. Although I do think Spinoza has organisms in mind as sort of paradigmatic individuals. And this is because Spinoza uses his principle of individuation is essentially what you call kenosis. And kenosis is sort of a striving to persevere in being. And when you flesh that out, it applies most obviously to organisms. Although striving isn't necessarily an organic concept, it's a principle in physics first. It means something like it tends to, stay in existence. So, but organisms are a great example of that. When you give this sort of the body runs around searching for food and so forth, staying alive. So basically, chapter 2 comes to the conclusion that if we want to find an individual, this is I think a key point. You've got to find something with a kenosis, a striving, a tendency to preserve itself in being as a particular unity that it is. But that's the upshot. Now, what counts exactly is this, since we're not restricting it to organisms. It's hard to say. You might ask a flock of sheep, or a school of fish, or a sports team, or a civil society, or any kind of institution is an individual. And Spinoza doesn't say specifically, here's my list of individuals, here's my list of non-individuals. So since he doesn't do that, we're kind of left to wonder that, which leads us to chapter 3. In this chapter, I look at the work of Alexander Mathurin. Mathurin, among a number of other things, argues that the state is a spinocistic individual. There is a passage where Spinoza talks about individuals being made of the simplest bodies, and then little individuals made up of those individuals, and individuals made up of those individuals, all the way up to the infinite individual, nature as a whole. And somewhere in the middle of that are human beings. So human beings are part of some larger individual. Which individual is it? Mathurin argues that it's the state. The state is that sort of individual. The state has a kind of kenosis, a striving to persevere itself. It makes treaties, it fights wars in self-defense, it punishes miscreants and things of that nature. So it has a certain kind of unity. But I follow Steve Barboni and Lee Rice in arguing that when Spinoza talks even about a state kind of striving and so on, he's really speaking sort of metaphorically. And the main argument there is that individuals exist for their own sake and in their own right, but the state is kind of a construction of human need and a construction of human desire. And since that's the case, the state exists for Spinozistic individuals. It doesn't seem to make sense that the individuals would exist as simply part of the state. The state is sort of, it arises naturally out of our human needs, but it's not a natural entity in its own right. It's natural for us to form this kind of situation. And I go on a little bit with that. The San Diego Chargers came up quite a bit in that chapter, as Dr. Starr pointed out, right? That I say, you talk about the San Diego Chargers as one thing, but they're not an individual. There's no individual called the Chargers.
I got break on those pages.
Yes, there you go. That's the football gets you on those. And I owe that, that's the, Steve Barboni mentioned that in an article, and I kind of took it from him in that regard. And moving to chapter 4, I start to kind of look at the sort of ethical implications of this. So I take on the view that Spinoza is considered an egoist. He's considered both an ethical and psychological egoist. Psychological egoist being one that's saying this is how people act. People act in their own self-interest. This is the way they behave. And an ethical egoist saying, well, this is how people should behave. The right thing to do is to pursue your own self-interest. And there are various arguments for that. And it's pretty common to read Spinoza this way. It's not universal. There's scholars who would not read Spinoza that way. But that's fairly common reading. He's kind of an enlightened egoist, meaning that he thinks morality and cooperation are good, but because they serve our self-interest, and so on. The crux of this chapter, and I look at several thinkers. I look at Rice's work again, and I look at a couple of feminist readings of Spinoza, Armstrong and Raven. And these readings all sort of agree, although in this respect, although they don't think. I think the two feminist writers misread Rice a little bit. They regard him as reading Spinoza as an egoist, which is not, I think, Rice's position. He can correct me if I'm wrong. But I don't think that's his position. I think they would all agree in the basic idea that Spinoza doesn't hold a kind of notion of the self as a self-focused, self-contained, sort of atomistic creature that is first concerned with its own good and its own impulses only, right? As if it was cut off from things outside. They also put this, Spinoza thinks that the individual is fundamentally related to his or her environment, fundamentally interactive with it, fundamentally shaped by it, fundamentally in relation to it, however you want to express that. And so you can't say that Spinoza thinks of these sort of atomic individuals pursuing their own interests and coming together to cooperate. Rather, they're sort of naturally in this network of embedded relationships. I don't know that all these thinkers use that language, but something like that is being argued. And I argue that this is actually incompatible with egoism, at least as normally understood. As normally understood, I think egoism is the view that I should be focused on, or I am, depending on whether we're a psychological or ethical egoist here. And I usually mean both. I just use the term egoism. That we're primarily focused on our own well-being, as if the well-being of others wasn't really important except as an afterthought. And I don't think Spinoza holds a conception of the self, an individual relation to others that allows that. So that's chapter 4. It has a few other interesting things in it too, but they're a little off our topic. Chapter 5, I can sum up pretty briefly. This is just kind of some concluding reflections for further study. It brings up Spinoza's theory of state. One thing I do want to point out is I find in Spinoza's writing that there's this sense where Spinoza thinks in terms of absolute obedience to authority. It's always rational to obey the authority rather than to disobey because of the advantages of civil society over being by yourself. And Spinoza seems to say that, but he does say there are two things we should understand about somebody living in a civil state. They're both citizens and subjects, and they're subjects insofar as they have to obey, but they are citizens insofar as certain benefits of civil society are conferred upon them. A certain standard of protection and security and peace is given to them, provided to them by the state. And we always have to be both subjects and citizens. So we're not just there to obey, we're there for certain advantages that would accrue to us as being citizens. And when one of my theses in here is when the state undermines our status as citizens, when the state doesn't confer upon us the benefits of citizenship, it loses its authority to expect obedience from us as subjects. And among these benefits, there are a number of things. I apply to some contemporary issues. I talk about Spinoza and health care coverage. I argue that Spinoza would be in favor of the view that everyone should have affordable and accessible health care coverage. How you would deliver that, who cares? That's not the point in that regard. The point is only that I think Spinoza would favor that conception of state where you need to be given certain goods. Maybe education would be there too. I just chose healthcare as one example among many. Or you're not getting the benefits of civil society. I think that is Spinoza's view. It differs a bit from some views popular today. We're a bit more hands-off in our approach to governance, I think, than Spinoza is. And maybe, we wouldn't be comfortable with his degree of state control in that regard. But that's sort of how I sum it up and come to a kind of conclusion, and that pretty much wraps up the 5 chapters.
Thank you very much.